It was 3 o'clock in the morning in the quiet countryside of Pennsylvania. The entire world seemed to be in slumber, but within the hushed walls of a secluded convent, a single candle sputtered and died, signaling the dawn of something timeless. For more than 50 years, Sister Mary Elizabeth had dedicated her life to a profound stillness. This was not a stillness born of solitude, but of deep, contemplative prayer. It was the kind of silence that resonated through ancient stone chapels and ascended with fragrant incense into the early morning light. Tucked away amidst the rolling wooded hills of Pennsylvania, her convent stood like a hidden sanctuary, seemingly forgotten by the passage of time and untouched by the clamor of the outside world. While the world rushed onward, within those sacred walls, life unfolded with the steady rhythm of religious services, the gentle rustle of scripture pages, and the soft chime of rosary beads. She was not known for divine visions, miraculous interventions, or extraordinary tales. Instead, her days were marked by simple acts of devotion. She was the one who meticulously swept the chapel steps before the first hint of sunrise, who prepared comforting tea during the long winter prayer vigils, and who expertly stitched the sisters' habits, her hands bearing the marks of years of diligent work and quiet aging. Her voice was seldom heard, and her name was barely a whisper to those outside the convent's protective embrace. Yet heaven, in its infinite wisdom, often chooses the most unassuming vessels. This awakening began in the deepest hour of the night, somewhere between the last hoot of an owl and the first blush of dawn. The convent lay shrouded in absolute quiet. Overnight, a blanket of snow had fallen, muffling the world in a profound hush. In the solitude of her cell, Sister Mary Elizabeth had just concluded her nightly prayers. The candle on her small desk had melted into a tranquil pool of wax. Her rosary rested gently across her chest as her breathing softened into sleep. And then it occurred. A scent, not a figment of imagination, nor the fragrance of flowers or perfume, but undeniably real. It was the scent of roses, freshly bloomed in the heart of winter. These were not the roses that graced the Pennsylvania landscape at this time of year. The aroma filled the air, subtle as a whisper. Before she even opened her eyes, a single word resonated within her spirit, a name: Mary. It was not a spoken word, nor a shouted command, but a profound feeling, like a gentle breath against her very soul. She sat up straight. The room was dim, yet not entirely dark. A soft luminescence emanated from beneath the narrow gap of her wooden door, pulsing with a faint, rhythmic beat akin to a gentle heartbeat. For a fleeting moment, she considered the possibility that one of the younger sisters had awoken early. However, the hallway beyond remained utterly empty and silent. Then it came again. Mary. The voice, or rather, the presence, lingered in the air like the comforting warmth after a tender embrace. Her heart began to pound, not with apprehension, but with a deep sense of reverence. Something sacred was near, something ancient and vibrantly alive. She rose, her bare feet touching the chill of the stone floor, clad only in her simple nightdress. Her steps were completely silent as she moved towards the chapel. As she turned the corner, the fragrance intensified, becoming richer, more vibrant, almost intoxicating. The very air seemed to shimmer. At the far end of the corridor, the chapel doors were slightly ajar. Within, a golden light flickered. It was not the glow of electricity or the flicker of a flame, but an ethereal luminescence, as if the stars themselves had gathered behind the altar. Her knees felt weak, but she pressed forward, her rosary clutched tightly like a lifeline. Upon gently pushing open the chapel door, she saw no immediate vision, not yet, but she felt her entire being pause, as if time, breath, and sound had collectively bowed in unison. Before her stood the familiar statue of the Blessed Virgin Mary, unchanged in form, yet profoundly different. The air surrounding it pulsed with an intangible grace, too profound for mere words. And within her heart, as clear as the morning light, the message arrived. Go to Washington, let them see. It was the voice of a mother, not merely asking, but calling. She remained silent. She did not run. She simply knelt, her voice a mere whisper, uttering the only response her soul could conceive. Here I am. That night, in a convent the world had seemingly forgotten, the heavens began to open, not with thunderous pronouncements or fiery displays, but with the tender gift of a rose and the gentle whisper of a name. None within the convent noticed any deviation from their usual morning routine. The sisters moved through their daily tasks with practiced quietude, morning prayers, a simple breakfast, dedicated scripture study, all unaware that one among them had just knelt before a presence far beyond this earthly realm mere hours earlier. Sister Mary Elizabeth maintained her outward composure, her weathered hands steady as she poured cups of tea, her face a placid mask beneath the white linen veil. Yet, within her, a profound transformation had begun. After breakfast, she returned to her small cell, gently closing the wooden door behind her, and exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she had been holding. The room appeared unchanged. Plain walls, a crucifix, a modest wooden desk adorned with a leather-bound prayer book. But the atmosphere was different. The air felt charged, as if an unheard melody was playing just beyond the range of human perception. She sat at the edge of her bed and opened her Bible, seeking clarity in words she had read countless times before. Instead, her gaze fell upon a single rose petal, resting perfectly in the center of a page. It was a deep red, with a single drop of dew still clinging to its edge. The Bible had been closed, and this petal had not been present moments before. She reached out to touch it, her hand trembling, and once again the scent of roses filled the air, fresh, vibrant, impossible. The message returned, not spoken aloud, but imprinted upon the stillness of her mind. Go to Washington, let them see. It was not a harsh command, but a gentle invitation, much like a mother's soft bill to her child, not to hasten, but to draw nearer. Sister Mary Elizabeth offered a silent prayer, then carefully tucked the rose petal into her missal. The meaning of "let them see" remained elusive. Let who see and see what? She had never ventured beyond the borders of Pennsylvania. The very idea of traveling to the nation's capital alone seemed utterly improbable. Yet the signs continued to manifest. Later that day, while tending to her usual afternoon task of sweeping the cloister garden, she paused beside the old iron gate. It was late winter, and the bushes stood bare, but nestled near the weathered stones, a single rose bud was pushing its way through the frozen earth, a defiant bloom of red against the monochrome landscape. As she reached for it, her hands trembling, a soft gust of wind swept through the garden. No birds chirped, no trees rustled. But in that profound hush, a familiar presence returned. Her eyes welled up, not with fear or sorrow, but with something far deeper, recognition, as if the very earth were bearing witness. That evening, during Vespers, she knelt in the pew furthest from the altar. The sanctuary was illuminated by flickering candles, their light casting dancing shadows across the stained glass windows, splashing halos of vibrant color onto the stone walls. The other sisters chanted the psalms, their voices rising and falling in a melodic cadence, like the ebb and flow of waves. But Sister Mary Elizabeth's own voice faltered. She was no longer merely reciting words. She was listening inwardly. And then the message came, clearer than ever before. You must go. You must walk. They must see that I still walk among them. This revelation was not couched in complex theology or grand visions. It arrived as a profound certainty, a truth that settled quietly into the core of her being, requiring no external validation. She did not request a miracle. She did not seek permission. She simply bowed her head, placed her hands over her heart, and accepted the divine summons. The remainder of the evening unfolded like any other. A quiet supper, a period of silence after compline, lights extinguished by 9 o'clock. Yet, beneath the veneer of routine, something ancient and momentous had been set in motion. In the profound stillness of her room, Sister Mary Elizabeth opened a small leather-bound journal, a cherished gift from her mother before she entered the convent nearly 50 years prior. On the first empty page, she wrote a single, impactful line. She spoke, "I must go, and they must see." That night, the wind outside intensified, and snow began to fall once more. But within her humble cell, beneath worn wool blankets and ancient wooden beams, a devoted servant of God lay wide awake, her spirit ignited by the silent language of a rose, a whisper, and a sacred mission that would soon reverberate through the very soul of a nation. She departed just after dawn. There were no farewell ceremonies, no public announcements, simply a solitary figure clad in gray wool, slipping through the convent's rear gate before the sun crested the Pennsylvania hills. Sister Mary Elizabeth carried only a simple canvas satchel containing her rosary, a well-worn Bible, a small bottle of water, and a folded scarf. She had no cell phone, no map, and no money, only unwavering faith and the quiet assurance of a voice that had spoken not to her ears, but directly to her soul. Frost still clung to the grass as she stepped onto the country road, her footsteps barely disturbing the gravel. The surrounding towns were still mostly asleep. Cars sat dormant in driveways, and porch lights winked out one by one. It was just her, and a destination she had never personally witnessed. Washington, D.C., the journey was not logical, it was not meticulously planned, but logic had no place in this unfolding narrative. Something far more ancient than reason was guiding her path. As she reached the edge of the first town, a gas station attendant glanced up as the nun passed. She offered a polite smile, then returned to her coffee. Moments later, however, the attendant stepped out of the store, holding a granola bar and a paper bag. "Ma'am," she called out, with a touch of uncertainty, "you look like, I don't know, like someone on a mission." Sister Mary Elizabeth turned, surprised, and nodded slowly. The woman placed the bag into her hands. "Don't ask me why," she added, "but I felt like I was supposed to give you this." Inside the bag was a sandwich, a bottle of juice, and a fresh apple. This was the first sign. It would certainly not be the last. Over the ensuing days, she continued her journey southward, traversing quiet highways, rural back roads, and wooded trails. At times, she accepted rides from strangers who offered them with genuine warmth. A young mother with 2 children in her minivan handed her a scarf just in case she needed it. A retired truck driver remarked, "You remind me of my sister. She used to pray like that." For the most part, however, she walked through small towns characterized by their steepled churches and the faded diners lining the shoulders of rural roads, where ancient trees stood like silent, watchful sentinels. The rosary beads at her waist swung gently with each stride, their soft clicking a gentle rhythm to her journey, the very pulse of her prayer. People noticed her, not because she sought attention, but because there was something in her presence that spoke to them. A young boy selling lemonade offered her a folded drawing of a woman clad in blue, her robe adorned with stars. A teenager on a skateboard paused to inquire, "Are you one of those nuns that talks to angels or something?" When she responded with a simple smile and no words, he nodded as if her silence was answer enough. Each evening she found refuge. Sometimes she slept on the steps of churches, other times in the quiet seclusion of barns or beneath the sheltering branches of trees. One night, within the corner of an old chapel in Maryland, a priest discovered her sleeping and gently covered her with his coat. He asked no questions about her identity, but simply whispered, "God must have sent you." On the 3rd night of her journey, she experienced a dream filled with light, not a harsh, blinding light, but one that was warm and alive. Within this luminous dream, a voice repeated the message she had already received. "Let them see." By this point, her shoes were worn thin, her knees ached persistently, and her body bore the undeniable imprint of every mile traveled. Yet her spirit had never felt clearer. She was not traveling with a predefined mission statement, nor was she seeking any form of recognition. She was answering a call, an ancient, intimate, and profoundly holy summons. Still, people continued to approach her, not in overwhelming crowds or chaotic throngs, but individually. Some offered her meals, while others simply requested her prayers. A woman in a roadside cafe discreetly passed her a folded napkin bearing 4 words, written in shaky ink. "She's still with us." On the 6th day, just beyond the outskirts of Northern Virginia, Sister Mary Elizabeth paused at the crest of a hill. Below her, a considerable distance away, the majestic dome of the Capitol building gleamed under the late afternoon sun. She inhaled deeply, the mingled scents of the city and the burgeoning spring filling the air. Her journey was not yet concluded. In fact, it was just beginning. It was a Sunday afternoon, and the National Mall was alive with the vibrant energy of a typical spring weekend. Children chased shimmering bubbles, tourists posed for photographs amidst the blooming cherry blossoms, and food trucks lined the streets, offering tempting arrays of tacos and lemonade. The sky above was a vast, unblemished expanse of sharp blue, stretching serenely across the monuments like a masterpiece painting. But a subtle shift was occurring. As the afternoon wore on, a quiet breeze began to stir. Initially soft and barely perceptible, it gradually grew steadier, more insistent, like a gentle exhalation from the heavens. Birds became restless, and dogs ceased their barking as people began to look upwards. Near the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, a teenager, engrossed in live streaming on TikTok, paused mid-sentence, blinking into the camera. "Wait, what is that?" she whispered, her viewers simultaneously witnessing the same phenomenon, a peculiar luminescence forming just beyond the distant Capitol dome, subtle at first, but steadily growing. At the far end of the mall, beneath the broad canopy of a sycamore tree, stood Sister Mary Elizabeth. Her arduous journey had concluded that very morning. 7 days of walking, praying, and silent weeping had brought her here. She had not consciously planned this destination. She had no clear idea of her next step, yet her feet had guided her, one instinctive step at a time, to the west-facing lawn behind the Capitol building. The wind stirred once more, and then it happened. In the very center of the sky, directly above the gleaming white marble of the Capitol, a radiant light began to unfold. It was not lightning, nor clouds, nor any discernible aircraft. It bloomed gently, like the slow unfurling of a flower in time-lapse photography. First, a shimmer, then a golden outline, and finally, a distinct form emerged, a figure composed not of earthly flesh, but of pure light. It was unmistakable. A woman, cloaked in flowing robes and enveloped in a mantle of deep blue, scattered with countless stars. Her hands were folded in supplication, her gaze cast downwards in an expression of profound compassion. She uttered no sound, remained motionless, yet every heart within that vast open space seemed to quicken, as if recognizing her, even without fully comprehending the reason why. Some individuals fell to their knees, others wept openly and without inhibition. Phones were dropped, voices trembled. News anchors, moments before preparing for routine Capitol updates, stood frozen before their cameras. One reporter, his voice barely audible, whispered into his microphone, "Mike, are we still rolling?" The figure hovered in silent majesty, not imposing, but overwhelmingly peaceful. Around her, the air shimmered, not with heat, but with something else entirely, as if time itself had momentarily slowed, as if the entire city was collectively inhaling the same sacred breath. And then, the bells chimed. 3 distinct notes emanating from an indiscernible source, not from a church, nor from the Capitol building itself, but simply 3 clear, resonant tolls echoing across the mall. 1, 2, 3. Somewhere near the reflecting pool, a small child, clutching her mother's hand, whispered, "Is that the lady from Grandma's prayers?" Her mother, unable to speak, could only nod, tears streaming down her face. Throughout this extraordinary event, Sister Mary Elizabeth remained still. Not at the forefront, not on a raised platform, but simply among the throng of people. Her worn rosary hung from her wrist, her eyes fixed upward, filling with tears. Not from what she was witnessing, but from the profound realization of its truth. The call, the journey, the rose, the message. Let them see. Now they were seeing. The vision lingered for what felt like an eternity, perhaps mere minutes, perhaps an age. Then, as gently as it had appeared, the light began to recede. The radiant form dissolved, not shattered, but absorbed, like sunlight being folded back into the heavens. The sky returned to its serene blue. The breeze subsided. The world resumed its ordinary rhythm, but nothing remained the same. People remained rooted to their spots, kneeling, praying, staring at the sky with wide, unblinking eyes. Tourists had transformed into pilgrims. The Capitol lawn had become a sacred altar, and in the ensuing silence, someone began to sing. It started softly. A single, trembling, untrained voice, singing a Salve Regina. Then another voice joined in, and another, until hundreds of voices ascended towards the sky where the vision had just vanished. No one could offer an explanation, but none was needed. They had witnessed enough. Heaven had spoken, not with words, but with a profound, undeniable presence. What transpired in the sky above the Capitol that day was merely the beginning. Long after the apparition faded, the lawn remained filled. Not as a spectacle, nor out of confusion, but from a reverent reluctance to depart. It was as if every person present understood, perhaps for the very first time in their lives, that they had stepped into a moment not meant to be hurried, a moment that had drawn back the veil between the visible and the divine. And then, the miracles began to unfold. It commenced at the eastern edge of the mall, near the sidewalk, where a young boy sat in a wheelchair. His mother crouched beside him, adjusting his blanket. He had been paralyzed from birth, his legs thin and unresponsive. She had brought him out for fresh air, a respite from the hospital, but as the last vestiges of light faded from the sky, the boy slowly, tremulously reached down and placed his feet on the ground. Initially, it appeared to be a mere muscle spasm. His mother instinctively reached out to steady him, but then he pushed with greater force, lifting his body upwards. Onlookers nearby gasped, uncertain whether to intervene. The boy stood, unsteady but upright. One step, then another. His mother didn't scream. She didn't even speak. She simply collapsed to her knees, sobbing into her hands. Not far from this scene, a woman in her 50s, known within her church community for having been mute since childhood, stood amidst a circle of strangers. As the crowd began to softly sing the concluding lines of the Salve Regina, she opened her mouth and sang. Not spoke, but sang. Her voice was delicate, like crystals struck gently in candlelight, clear and perfectly pitched. She sang as if she had practiced this skill every day of her life. The strangers surrounding her ceased their singing, stunned into silence. One woman whispered, "I know her. She can't. She's never." But the song continued, a hymn of tears and trembling hands raised to the sky. Not all the miracles were grand or dramatically apparent. Some were internal, invisible, yet no less potent. A man near the Capitol steps, who had once publicly mocked faith online and ridiculed those who believed in divine matters, sat cross-legged on the grass, silently clutching a small crucifix that had belonged to his late mother. He had worn it that day as a jest. Now he pressed it against his lips, tears tracing paths down his face. A teenage girl, who had been planning to run away from home the very next day, knelt near the reflecting pool, whispering a prayer for her father's forgiveness, even though he was not present. And beneath a cherry blossom tree, a woman, wrapped in a scarf, fell to her knees with a gasp. For years, she had concealed her faith, fearing judgment. Now she held her hands high, crying openly, whispering the Hail Mary in her native Arabic. This was not chaos. It was profound healing. People who had never met before embraced each other like long-lost family. Arguments dissolved into sincere apologies. Strangers offered their coats, their hands, their prayers. No one inquired about one's church affiliation or whether they had believed in the Virgin Mary the previous day. The only thing that held significance was what had been felt, what had been witnessed, and what had been irrevocably changed. News crews inevitably arrived, drones buzzed overhead, but no camera could truly capture the essence of what was unfolding. They could record images, certainly, but not the profound silence, not the way people looked at each other with a newfound understanding, not the palpable weight of the moment pressing upon the soul like a warm stone on the chest. When a reporter asked a bystander if he believed it was all real, the man paused. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he gestured towards the boy now standing on his own, then towards the woman still singing, and finally towards the vast sea of people, many of whom had remained in place for hours. "Do you need it to be any more real than that?" he finally responded. At one edge of the assembled crowd, Sister Mary Elizabeth sat quietly on a bench. Her legs ached from the arduous journey. Her shoes were nearly disintegrating, but she scarcely noticed. She clutched the rosary in her hands and whispered a simple prayer of gratitude, not for the spectacle, but for the opened hearts. Because she understood the most significant miracle was not what had occurred in the sky, but what had transpired within them. One by one, people began to rise and walk home. Not as mere tourists or ordinary citizens, but as pilgrims. They carried with them no tangible proof, no footage worthy of major headlines. But they carried something far deeper. A profound understanding, a renewed call, and across the city, indeed, across the entire country, the stories began to spread. They were not disseminated from pulpits or press conferences, but from family dinner tables, hospital rooms, prison chapels, and school hallways. Whispers of healing, of rekindled hope, of a presence that had never truly departed, but had simply awaited a welcoming embrace once more. In the days that followed, as skeptics debated and theologians meticulously reviewed the events, the people who had been present already knew, with absolute certainty, that something holy had descended, and that nothing would ever be the same again. The miraculous accounts spread with astonishing speed, initially through word of mouth, then via shaky cell phone footage, and eventually reaching every major media outlet across the nation. Some dismissed it as mass hysteria, others hailed it as a beacon of hope. But for those who had been there, no further explanation was necessary. They had seen what they had seen. They had felt what they had felt. And among them, Sister Mary Elizabeth quietly made her way back to the convent. She offered no words to the assembled reporters at Union Station, no desire for interviews. Her name remained unknown. She simply boarded a bus heading south, her hands clasped, a faraway look in her eyes. The driver inquired if she required assistance finding her seat. She responded with a gentle smile and a soft whisper, "He has already guided me." Upon her arrival back at the convent shortly before sunset, the other sisters rushed to meet her. They had seen the television coverage and heard the hushed rumors. One young novice exclaimed, "Sister Mary, was that truly you on the lawn?" But she offered no immediate reply, simply stating, "Not yet." Her footwear was significantly worn, and her habit bore the traces of city grime. She moved with quiet grace through the corridors, ascended the stairs, and entered her humble cell. And there, in the tranquility of twilight, it occurred once more. Not with the fanfare of trumpets, nor the rumble of thunder, but with a radiant light, gentle and golden, pulsing as if with each breath. It permeated the entirety of her room, casting no discernible shadow, yet bathing everything in a warm, maternal luminescence. The window was shut, the lamp extinguished, yet her cell glowed as if the very essence of heaven had seeped through the smallest of openings. And at the heart of this light stood the same ethereal figure from the sky, her eyes brimming with boundless compassion, the mother herself. She spoke not with human articulation, but her very presence conveyed volumes. It filled the space, and time itself seemed to pause, yielding to its profound impact. Sister Mary Elizabeth sank to her knees, utterly overcome, yet devoid of fear. Her heart pounded, not with apprehension, but with deep reverence. The air was rich with the fragrance of roses, an intense and authentic scent, reminiscent of a moonlit garden in full bloom. The Blessed Virgin regarded her with the tenderness of a mother observing a daughter returned from a long and arduous journey. Then, without uttering a sound, she extended her hands. In her right palm rested a single, flawless red rose, its petals still adorned with glistening dew. Though no rain had fallen, no storm had passed, only pure grace. She stepped forward and gently placed the rose against Sister Mary's chest. There was no searing heat, no dramatic display, only an enveloping warmth, as if the bloom had taken root not in her flesh, but in her very soul. In that profound instant, Sister Mary Elizabeth grasped not only the vision, but the purpose of her mission and the immense significance of it all. The rose was not a token to be kept, but a message to be carried, a testament to be felt, not seen. The apparition gradually faded, the light receded, and Sister Mary Elizabeth found herself awake on the wooden floor of her cell, the sweet scent of roses still lingering, and a delicate object resting upon her habit. It was the rose, as fresh and vibrant as when the Holy Mother herself had placed it there. With trembling fingers, she touched it. It felt cool to her skin, yet radiated an inner warmth. Its petals, though soft, were firm, imbued with a living essence. She did not hasten to share her experience with the other sisters, nor did she cry out or run through the convent. Instead, she calmly sat at her desk, opened the aged leather journal her own mother had gifted her, and began to write. She returned. This time, she entrusted me with a burden to bear. By morning, the entire convent would be aware, and not long thereafter, the church would also know. But that night, in the most unassuming room of a humble convent nestled in Pennsylvania, a rose lay upon a nun's chest, and heaven had once again graced the earth with its touch. By the first light of dawn, the subtle yet unmistakable fragrance of roses had wafted through the convent's corridors. The sisters, already stirred by the events unfolding in Washington, now moved with a hushed reverence, as if sensing that something sacred had crossed their threshold during the night. At breakfast, Sister Mary Elizabeth sat in quiet contemplation. She cradled her cup of tea with both hands, the rose still nestled against her chest, concealed beneath her habit like a cherished secret destined for eventual revelation. Across the table, the Mother Superior observed her with a knowing gaze, devoid of suspicion, yet rich with the wisdom of one who had lived long enough to recognize the subtle whispers of the divine in ordinary lives. That afternoon, within the modest confines of the convent's office, Sister Mary Elizabeth recounted everything to the Mother Superior. Her account was delivered without fanfare or embellishment, a simple, unadorned truth. She spoke of her walk, the extraordinary vision, her time in the capital, the miraculous occurrences, and the subsequent reappearance, the rose now resting peacefully between the folded pages of her prayer journal. The Mother Superior listened attentively, her eyes glistening with emotion, without interruption. When the narrative concluded, she gently placed her hand over Sister Mary's and declared, "We shall contact the diocese. This matter requires careful and humble presentation." 2 days later, the missive reached the Archbishopric of Philadelphia. Within 24 hours, an official inquiry was initiated. The Church adhered to established protocols for such occurrences, procedures that were both lengthy and meticulously detailed. Apparitions were not summarily dismissed, but their acceptance was never taken lightly. The Church proceeded not with haste or emotion, but with profound discernment. A week after the letter was dispatched, a vehicle arrived at the convent's gravel driveway. 3 men alighted. Among them was Auxiliary Bishop Thomas Gart, a man renowned for his stern countenance and benevolent spirit. Accompanying him were two priests, one a theologian from the seminary, and the other a trained psychologist. The sisters observed from the upper hallway as the visitors were received. Few words were exchanged, but prayers were offered by all. In a quiet chamber adorned with books and crucifixes, Sister Mary Elizabeth sat before the assembled men. She displayed no outward nervousness, but was clearly prepared. The bishop requested her account of events, not once, but twice, first allowing her to speak uninterrupted, and then asking for specific details in fragmented portions. The priests listened intently, scrutinizing for any inconsistencies, any signs of embellishment or delusion. What they discovered, however, was a woman of remarkable clarity and profound inner peace. Her narrative remained unwavering, her gaze steady. And when she carefully unwrapped the rose, still fresh and inexplicably dewy, even the bishop leaned forward in silent contemplation. They inquired about her physical and mental well-being, her spiritual practices, and her past. They asked about her meals that day and any medications she might be taking. To every question, she responded with unaffected grace and without a hint of pride. At the conclusion of the interview, Bishop Gart stood and clasped his hands. "Sister," he stated, "we cannot definitively say what the Church's decision will be at this juncture, but I can affirm this much. I believe that you genuinely believe in what you have witnessed." She responded with a simple nod, not as a gesture of triumph, but of understanding. Later that week, a formal letter arrived from the Chancery. Her testimony had been formally accepted and would be forwarded to the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith in Rome. The letter did not guarantee validation, but it assured continued prayer and investigation, which was entirely sufficient for Sister Mary Elizabeth. The Church's approval was not essential for her lived experience. The rose continued to rest upon her desk, its fragrance undiminished, and the voice echoed within her heart. And beyond the convent walls, across the streets, churches, and correctional facilities of America, a transformation had already begun. People were experiencing a shift, not due to media reports or her personal involvement, but because the heavens had reached down to touch the very earth. The Church, with its characteristic caution and diligent approach, was now actively listening. The rose remained as vibrant as ever, its scent still perfuming her cell. And across the nation, hearts continued to open, one soul at a time. It did not commence with widespread headlines, nor did it originate in churches or from pulpits. It began as a quiet whisper, traversing from one heart to another. In a small town in Iowa, a teenage girl, who had long since abandoned her prayers, found herself inexplicably reaching for her grandmother's rosary one evening. She couldn't explain the impulse, but she followed it. As she held the beads, a profound longing, not of guilt or fear, stirred within her. On that same night, across the continent in a San Diego hospital, a man who had been estranged from his brother for 2 decades picked up the telephone and made the call. Something extraordinary was transpiring. Following the celestial apparition above the Capitol and Sister Mary Elizabeth's discreet return, the narrative of events unfolded with astonishing rapidity. Initially, social media platforms buzzed with fleeting video clips capturing phenomena in the sky. Ethereal voices in song, and crowds kneeling on the polished marble of public spaces. Subsequently, personal testimonies began to emerge. A woman in Texas, previously blind, claimed to have experienced sight for the first time in years. An inmate in an Ohio penitentiary described hearing a distinct voice within his cell after viewing a news broadcast. People were no longer seeking mere confirmation, they were actively searching for deeper meaning. Parishes that had once struggled with sparse attendance now found themselves overflowing on Sunday mornings, with confession lines extending far down the aisles. In Detroit, a priest contemplating retirement chose to remain, profoundly moved by the surge of young men expressing interest in the seminary. In Atlanta, a Baptist minister extended an invitation to his Catholic neighbor to address his congregation, not for debate, but for a shared moment of prayer. Walls of division were being dismantled. In Phoenix, a group of high school students initiated a daily ritual of reciting the Hail Mary before classes commenced, many of them not even identifying as Catholic. A grocery store clerk in Minneapolis made it a practice to offer complimentary pocket crucifixes with every customer receipt. In New Orleans, a jazz musician began concluding his performances with a rendition of Ave Maria, played softly and slowly like a lullaby for the soul. And universally, roses, left at church entrances, appeared to bloom in unexpected locales, flourishing in sidewalk cracks, on snow-covered hillsides, and on hospital window ledges. While some attributed these occurrences to mere coincidence, others recognized a deeper significance. They referred to it as the Marian Spring. Sister Mary Elizabeth received no public acclaim, nor did she solicit any. Nevertheless, the convent was inundated with correspondence from truck drivers, educators, single mothers, and military veterans. Their letters spoke of dreams, shared confessions, or simply expressed gratitude for her quiet journey. The church, maintaining its cautious approach, continued its thorough investigation. However, the populace did not await an official endorsement. The movement had already taken root. In the Bronx, a young boy affixed a handwritten sign to a lamppost that read, "She's still with us, I believe." A woman in Montana traveled 4 hours only to kneel in silent contemplation outside a chapel. A former atheist professor in Seattle began each of his lectures with 30 seconds of silence, dedicating it to those who were heeding a higher call. There was no organized leadership, no centralized control. It was not a revival in the conventional sense, but rather a profound return. It was not ostentatious or politically charged, but a gentle turning of souls, one by one, towards something ancient and eternal, toward a presence, a mother's voice that had never ceased its call. Throughout all of this, the prevailing question was not whether it had truly occurred, but rather what would be the collective response. This, in itself, was the miracle. Not the spectacle in the sky, but the awakening that had taken place across the nation. A wave of faith, not imposed by force, but freely embraced, was gaining momentum. By early December, a profound shift had taken root in the American spirit. It was not a fleeting trend or a temporary movement, but a deep-seated yearning for quietude, for meaning, and for God. It began with a simple concept: one night, one prayer, one nation. There was no official organizer, no political agenda, merely an invitation that rippled from diocese to diocese, from church bulletins to social media posts. It was named the Vigil of Light, a nationwide night of prayer scheduled for December the 12th, the feast day of Our Lady of Guadalupe. The news spread like wildfire. In Denver, a priest urged his parishioners to bring candles, we're going outside. In Miami, a group of teenagers organized a midnight rosary procession along the beachfront. In Cleveland, a retired couple distributed over 1,000 votive candles at their local grocery store. When questioned about their actions by the cashier, the elderly gentleman smiled and replied, "Because someone is coming." Meanwhile, in Washington, D.C., preparations commenced for an event of unprecedented scale. The National Mall, typically a venue for rallies and protests, was granted a special permit for a single night of prayer for the vigil. There were to be no amplified speeches, no organized addresses, only prayer. The church had designated the date, the people provided the substance. On the evening of December the 12th, they arrived. By 7 o'clock in the evening, the lawn was already thronged with attendees. Families with young children bundled in blankets, elderly women cloaked in shawls, priests in their clerical attire, seminarians in their academic robes, and nuns in a spectrum of habit colors were present. There were no banners or identifying symbols, merely a vast expanse of people holding unlit candles, awaiting a signal. By 9 o'clock, the crowd had swelled to over 300,000. They continued to arrive on foot, by bus, in wheelchairs, converging in silent unity from all 50 states, representing every spectrum of belief and every degree of doubt. Sister Mary Elizabeth stood quietly near the periphery of the gathering, behind the reflecting pool. She had remained publicly silent since the apparition, declining interviews and evading cameras, yet she was present, her familiar rosary in hand, the rose still nestled within her journal. She had no need for a microphone. Her message had already been delivered. Walk, let them see. At 11:45 p.m., the distant bells of the basilica began to chime, not by a predetermined schedule, but seemingly by an instinctive, unified impulse. A profound hush swept across the lawn, akin to a gentle breeze rustling through a field of wheat. The ambient lights dimmed, leaving only the majestic dome of the Capitol illuminated, resembling a distant lighthouse piercing the darkness. Then, a priest emerged from the shadows, holding a single candle whose flame flickered softly. Without uttering a word, he raised it high. Gradually, others followed suit, lifting their candles and passing the flame from hand to hand. A luminous river flowed across the mall, stretching from the Lincoln Memorial to the base of the Washington Monument. Within a span of less than 5 minutes, 500,000 flames shimmered in unison, each borne by hands that trembled, faces etched with tears and hearts filled with hope. A mother held her daughter close, whispering, "This is how heaven touches earth." A teenage boy gazed at his candle as if witnessing light for the very first time. A soldier, recently returned from deployment, closed his eyes, offering a silent prayer for the comrades he had lost. And then the singing commenced. A single voice emerged, joined by another, then by 1,000 more. There was no accompanying band, no loudspeakers, just a singular melody ascending into the night. Ave Maria Gratia Plena. Sister Mary Elizabeth's lips moved in silent accompaniment, her words barely audible but heartfelt. The crowd sang not to impress, but to surrender. They were not there to be observed, but to perceive, to listen, to return. And in the precise moment the final verse faded into silence, something shifted in the celestial expanse. The stars seemed to part ever so slightly. While definitive confirmation remained elusive, countless thousands would attest to witnessing a faint outline, a luminous blue mantle, a benevolent presence observing with a gentle smile. No camera captured it with absolute clarity, nor did any satellite verify its existence. Yet its significance was undeniable, for the light was no longer confined to the heavens, it now resided within them. The vigil continued into the early hours of the morning. Some people knelt in prayer, others walked barefoot across the grass, their silent petitions carried on the night air. Many held the hands of strangers, whispering intentions for loved ones. At 2 o'clock in the morning, Sister Mary Elizabeth sat on the stone steps of the mall, gazing out at the sea of candles. Her eyes were damp, her expression serene. A small child, no older than 5, approached her. The girl remained silent, simply extending her unlit candle. Sister Mary Elizabeth struck a match and gently lit it. As the flame caught, the child smiled and whispered, "She's still here, isn't she?" The nun nodded slowly. "Yes," a voice from nearby murmured, "she never left." And as the sun began its ascent over the Capitol dome, casting a golden hue upon the hushed, luminous crowd, it became evident to all. This was not a conclusion, but a commencement. A mother had issued a call, and a nation had responded. Weeks elapsed. The illumination from the mall had long since dissipated. The rose petals, once scattered by unseen forces across convent gardens and public grounds, had returned to the earth. News organizations moved on to new narratives. Headlines shifted focus elsewhere. However, the story remained unfinished, for the true miracle was not what had appeared in the sky, but what had taken root and endured within the hearts of those who had witnessed it, and even those who, despite not having seen, still held a profound belief. In a classroom within a public school in Kansas, a third-grade boy began to offer a quiet prayer before his midday meal each day. No one had instructed him, no one had encouraged him. But when asked about his actions one afternoon, he simply shrugged and replied, "Because she's watching." In Los Angeles, a man who had previously worked in the realm of political attack advertisements entered a confessional for the first time in 35 years. "I'm not entirely sure why I'm here," he confessed to the priest, "but I couldn't dismiss what I witnessed in D.C. Something within me underwent a profound and beneficial transformation." Within the confines of a cold prison cell outside Detroit, a woman knelt beside her bunk at midnight, clutching a rosary sent to her by a stranger. Through tears, she whispered a single poignant plea: "Forgive me. I wish to come home." These personal accounts never graced the news cycles. They were not overtly dramatic, nor were they widely shareable. Yet, they constituted the very essence of the phenomenon. Because the miracle was not in the rose that retained its freshness for weeks, nor in the child who experienced the gift of walking for the first time, nor in the singing that rose from the darkness like a collective prayer from a wounded world. The miracle resided in the turning, in the moment a soul ceased its flight, in the breath where silence yielded to surrender, in the tear that fell not from sorrow, but because something within had been rediscovered. Faith did not erupt like a sudden burst of fireworks. Rather, it rekindled itself like candlelight passed from hand to hand across the nation. And in the profound quiet of her cell, Sister Mary Elizabeth came to understand. Her days of traversing roads or addressing public gatherings were over. The journey had been completed. The message had reached its intended destination. Her mission now was more personal, yet no less sacred. One evening, while engaged in sweeping the chapel, she paused beside a young novice kneeling at the altar. The girl looked up and softly inquired, "Do you think she will appear again?" The elder nun offered a gentle smile, her hand resting over her heart, and replied, "She never left." Beyond the convent walls, in churches and homes, hospitals and rehabilitation centers, people continued to returning to prayer, to one another, to forgiveness, and ultimately, to God. And within this return, this quiet pivot of the soul back towards its divine origin, the most authentic miracle unfolded, not for public spectacle or definitive proof, but for all eternity. Because when the sky opens, when a rose blossoms in the depths of winter, when silence possesses a greater power than any sermon, heaven is not merely above us, it resides within us, awaiting remembrance. Therefore, wherever you may be tonight, if you feel estranged, if you have been absent for a considerable time, or if you have never dared to believe, know that it is never too late. The doors are open, the light is present, and the mother continues to wait. If this narrative has resonated with something deep within your heart, do not keep it to yourself. Like this video, subscribe to Touched by Grace and share it with someone who is in need of hope today. Because at times, a story is more than just a story. It is a pathway.